I live with this mic? I am live with this mic. So, well, this is very exciting. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the London Super Comic Convention. My name is Duncan McAlpine, and it is my very great honour and privilege to welcome to the stage, well, quite simply, the greatest comic book creator that there has ever been in the whole industry. This is a man who's enjoyed a career spanning 70 years. He's on his first visit to London in 40 years. Please give a very warm welcome to the amazing, the incredible, the fantastic Mr. Stan Lee! Okay, very good. Stan, so good to see you. So good to see you. But tell me, this is your first visit to London in 40 years. Where have you been?
Well, I've been in... Oh, is this... Oh. I've been in America where I live, but this is my second favorite country in the whole world next to America, because my wife is English, and I love the English.
This is really a chat between you and me, looking back over your life. This is 70 years. This is 70 years of your career. So let's take it right back to the very first days. So you grew up in the 1920s, 1930s. Did you read comic books? Were you aware of comic books? Before you joined Time in 1939, what kind of comic books did you read?
Well, they didn't have the kind of is this all right? I can't tell if it's going out or not. They didn't have the kind of superhero books they have today. When I was a kid, the best they had was a detective called Dick Tracy, and they had Popeye, and they had the Cats and Jama Kids, and they had Blondie, and Smitty. But there weren't... Superman wasn't around when I was very young. I think he was the first, really, of the superheroes. So I was reading regular books, too. And I read as many adventure books as I could. I read Jules Verne, and I read, of course, my favorite was Sherlock Holmes. I mean, man, when I came to England years ago, the first thing I did was look for his house on Baker Street. And I read everything, Tarzan, everything I could that was involved people who were bigger than life and smarter and more adventurous. And I love going to the movies. My favorite star, some of you young people won't know him, but his name was Errol Flynn. And boy, he played Captain Blood, and he was the sheriff of Dodge City, and he was Robin Hood, and to me, he was the world's greatest hero. I wanted to grow up to be Errol Flynn. Instead, I became Spider-Man.
So tell us about your answering the advert to go to Timely Comics in 1939. And you went to Timely Comics under Joe Simon.
I was looking, I had many jobs when I was a teenager. I was an usher in the theater on Times Square. In those days, being an usher was like being a West Point cadet or one of the guards at Buckingham Palace. I mean, you reported in the morning and there was somebody who checked your costume, your uniform. If there was one button that wasn't polished, you were in big trouble. So anyway, I was an usher, I was an office boy, I had a job delivering sandwiches from a drugstore to the offices next door, and I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know how to get into that. And then I heard that there was a job publishing company called Magazine Management Company. And strangely enough, it was owned by the husband of a cousin of mine. And that's how I heard of the job. So I applied, and I applied to Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who at that time were doing Captain America. And I didn't realize even that this company had comic books. I thought they published, and they did publish regular magazines, but they also published comic books, and that's where the opening was. So I got the job, and I was like a stooge. I mean, I was the guy who, in those days, they dipped the pen in ink. So I filled the inkwells. I ran down and got their lunch and coffee for them. I erased the pages, and I was happy. It was a job, and it was a publishing company. Anyway, after I was there for a number of months, Simon and Kirby quit. It was only a three-man department. I was the third man. So my publisher came over to me and he said, could you hold down the job of editor and art director until I hire a grown-up? I was only about 17 or 18. Well, when you're that young, what do you know? I said, sure, I can do it. And I think he forgot about me because he never hired anyone else, and I stayed there ever since, and the rest is history.
So tell us about your very first comic book story in Captain America #3.
He knows more about me than I do. In those days, and this is a dull story, I'll make it quick. The comic book publishers wanted to have what they called second-class entry at the post office, which meant they could mail the magazines to people at paying less postage than normally. And in order to have second-class entry, there had to be at least a half a page of words without pictures in the comic book. Because if you had at least a half a page of text, you were allowed to call it a magazine and get second-class entry at the post office. If you didn't have half a page of text, you had to pay more money to mail the magazine to subscribers. So somebody had to write those text pieces, which nobody read, because the people who bought the magazine weren't interested in those little stories. They wanted to see the comics. So who got the job of writing the text pieces that nobody read? Yeah, I did. So the first story I wrote was a little text piece in Captain America #3, which nobody read.
So you spent the next years before you went into the army and out of the army doing comic books. But what happened in the 1950s? You felt that comics went a bit bland, a bit safe. What happened in the 1950s comics?
Well, in the 1950s, I had been there for about almost 20 years. And the books were doing well. They were selling, and everything was fine. But I felt I wasn't getting anywhere. What was worse? My publisher felt that the only people who read comic books were either little children or adults who weren't too intelligent. He didn't have much respect for his own readers. So consequently, he used to tell me, don't use words of more than 2 syllables. Don't worry about characterization or drama or anything like that. Just write stories with a lot of action, with a lot of fighting, with a lot of stuff going on. And I did. I did it okay. He was happy, but I wasn't happy with what I was writing. Oh, and we did all kinds of stories. We had romance comics, we had war comics, mystery, funny comics, little teenage comics, every type. I'll tell you a funny thing about the romance comics. They were supposed to be confessions. In other words, they were written in the first person as if the girl was telling the story. So it might be something like, "The Man I Loved Left Me" might have been the title. Or, "Will I Ever Find Romance?" But they were supposed to be written by girls. But I was writing them. Now, I love putting my name on everything I write, but I couldn't have a story that was supposed to be written by a girl that said by Stan Lee. So I wondered, how can I put my name on these? And then I got one of my brightest ideas. On the first page of those stories, I wrote, "As told to Stan Lee," as though the girl had told me her story. So I was able to put my name, and I totally have not answered your question, so forgive me. So what happened was I was really kind of fed up with the kind of stories I was doing. And I said to my wife, my English wife from up north, she's a Geordie. I said to her, "Honey, I think I want to quit my job. There's got to be something I can do better than this." And she gave me the greatest piece of advice you could give anybody. She said, "Stan, you don't like the stories, the type of stories you're writing. Why don't you write one the way you like to write it? The worst that'll happen, you'll get fired, but you want to quit anyway, and you'll get it out of your system." I thought that was a very sage bit of advice. So I went home, and I thought of something I would like to write, and I thought of the Fantastic Four. I thought I would try a superhero story that was perhaps a little different than others. And I did it. Luckily, it sold well. So then my publisher said, "Why don't you do a few more?" So I don't exactly remember the order. The next one might have been the Hulk or the X-Men.
That's right, it was the Hulk. Let me just read them to you. Fantastic Four #1 in November 1961, followed by the Hulk in May 62, and then Amazing Fantasy 15, which we'll come to in a little bit.
Oh, the Spider-Man one. Well, with Spider-Man, some of you may have heard this story, but for those who haven't, it's a strange story. I wanted to get a new character, a new superhero, and I saw a fly crawling on a wall, and I said to myself, that would be a great power for a hero if he could crawl on walls like an insect. And I tried to think of a name, and I thought of Insect Man. That didn't sound dramatic. The Fly Man, Mosquito Man, and then I thought of Spider-Man and Spider-Man. Oh boy, that sounded great to me. And I figured I'm going to make him a teenager, because there were teenagers in comics, but they were always sidekicks. Batman had Robin, Captain America had a kid named Bucky, and I always felt if I were a grown-up, I wouldn't hang around with some teenager. It wasn't natural. So I said, I'm going to get a teenager, but he won't be a sidekick. I'm going to make him the hero of the story. And I did, and then I figured I would give him a lot of problems. Because the superheroes that I had read about never had problems. The only problem Superman ever had was he hoped when he took off his glasses that Lois Lane wouldn't realize he was Superman. And Batman was just a rich guy who fought the bad guys. He didn't have any problems. So I figured I'm going to make our teenage Spider-Man a kid who doesn't have many girlfriends. He's not that good looking. He doesn't have any money. He's an orphan. He lives with his aunt. I thought the average kid, the average teenager could perhaps relate to that. So that was it. And then I told my publisher what I wanted to do. And he said to me, Stan, that is the worst idea I have ever heard. And he gave me 3 reasons. He said, first of all, people hate spiders, you can't call a book Spider-Man. Secondly, you can't make a teenager a hero. A teenager can only be a sidekick. And finally, superheroes don't have problems. That's why they're superheroes. Don't you know anything about heroes? So he wouldn't let me do it. And I was very frustrated because I liked the idea of Spider-Man. So a little bit later, there was a book we were going to kill. It wasn't selling too well, although I loved it. It was called Amazing Fantasy. Now, when you're going to kill a book, nobody cares when you put in the last issue, because it's the last issue. So I put Spider-Man in that issue. I featured him on the cover and forgot about it. About a month later, when the sales figures came in, my publisher called me and he said, "Hey Stan, you remember that character Spider-Man that we both liked so much?" He said, "Why don't we do a series about him?" And the rest is history. Thank you.
So Stan, tell us about how you related to your fans with your Stan soapbox, the Merry Marvel Marching Society. You really talk to your comics fans.
Well, I read the other comic books, and all that they had were stories. Some were good stories, some were bad stories. I didn't know who wrote them, I didn't know who drew them. They really didn't have any credits in them. And I would read the book and put it away, and that was the end of it. And I thought, there must be a way to make reading comics a better experience, to get to know. I wanted to know the people who were reading my stories, and I wanted them to know me, and I wanted them to know the people working at Marvel. Actually, it wasn't called Marvel at the beginning. When the superheroes started selling well, I think the books in those days were called Atlas Comics. But I felt, I want to change the name. We're on to something good. So I changed the name to Marvel Comic. And I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. I felt I wanted it to be a friendlier type of thing. So I started writing a column called Stan's Soapbox, where I would just talk to the readers, tell them anything on my mind, and get fan mail. And I like to read what the readers had to say. And I like to feel that I knew our readers, they knew me. And another thing, I love movies and I love the screen credits. I like to know who directed a movie, who starred in it, who did the editing and so forth. And I thought it would be fun to do the same with the comics. So naturally I like using my own name, so I made sure it always said written by Stan Lee, or presented by Stan Lee. And I put the artist's name, and I put the inker's name, and the letterer's name. Again, I wanted the fans to get to know us. And I even tried to make them a little bit funny. Like I'd have one credit that would say, and I'm making this up, I don't exactly remember, but written with great gusto by Stan Lee, drawn with great enthusiasm by Jack Kirby, and lettered with an inky pen, with a leaky pen point by Art Simic. I always tried to make it a little bit of a gag, and the fans seemed to enjoy that. Now I started to tell you about the name Marvel, and I'll tell you about DC. And this is something that really amused me. After we changed our name to Marvel Comics, DC had been called National Comics, and they decided to change their name also. They weren't going to let us be the only name change. So I understand they paid some professional company a lot of money to come up with the perfect name for them. I didn't know there were companies that you pay to give you names, but anyway. They thought and they thought and they thought, and I want you to get this. We became Marvel Comics, and they came up with the name DC. I mean, I could have done better than that with my eyes shut, but I was glad. But don't misunderstand. I love those guys are all my friends. I mean, and we kid around about this a lot. At any rate, am I still on track or did I forget the question? I tend to talk and then I forget what I'm talking about.
I think because you've been very generous over the years talking about your co-creators, like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko. Tell us something about working with those great, great artists.
Well, we had a style called, by the way, you're real good at this. We had a style called the Marvel style of working, and what that was, originally I had written all the scripts, and I wrote them in script form. I typed them out just like a movie script. Page 1, panel 1. So-and-so is walking down the street, and this is what he says, and so forth. But we became so busy that I didn't have time for this reason. All of our artists were freelancers. That meant they were working at home. They didn't get salaries, but they were paid by the page. Every time they did a story, they got paid depending how many pages it was. If they didn't have anything to draw, they weren't making money because they didn't get a salary. And they were all friends of mine, and they were all important to the company. I couldn't let them sit around with nothing to draw because that would cost them money. But at the same time, I couldn't write fast enough to keep all of them busy. So I came up with the idea. Let's say the Fantastic Four. Jack Kirby was waiting to do a Fantastic Four, but I was writing Spider-Man for Steve Ditko. But I couldn't keep Jack waiting until I finished the Spider-Man story, so I'd call Jack and I'd say, look, I don't have time to write the whole story, but what I want you to do is, I don't know, Dr. Doom kidnaps Sue Storm and takes her to Latveria, and the Fantastic Four have to go to Latveria to rescue her. And I give him a few more details of an idea that I had for a story. He would go home and he would draw the whole thing based on what I had told him without needing a whole script. And he was so good at this that by the time he brought the drawings in, it was a beautiful story based on the few things I told him. And I did the same with Steve Ditko. I said, look, with Spider-Man, just have I don't know, there's some old guy named the Vulture, and he comes along and he does this, and Spidey fights him, and this is the way he beats him, and I wouldn't have to tell Steve more than that. He would go home and draw it. They would, and the same with Don Heck, and the same with John Romita, and all the John Buscema, and all the great artists who worked with us. They would then bring in the pages in pencil, and I would put in all the dialogue balloons and the captions. And that didn't take me long at all, fast at that. So I could do that in a couple of hours. I would take the whole story, put in the dialogue balloons, the captions, the sound effects. And I was very particular about the lettering. To me, in a comic strip, in a comic book, the lettering is part of the artwork. Sometimes I'll look at a comic book somewhere and I'll say they're not paying enough attention to the lettering because the lettering won't be placed in such a way that it enhances the artwork, but sometimes it'll interfere with the artwork. The dialogue balloon may be too big or too small or in the wrong place. And another thing, if the drawing was very exciting, I put in very little lettering. I wanted the artwork to show. If the drawing was just, let's say, two heads of two people talking, that's when I would put in a lot of dialogue, because it wasn't that exciting anyway, so it gave me a chance to put in a lot that explained the story a little bit more. So there's a lot that goes into it. It's not just a case of lettering something and going to the next page. A lot of thought really goes into those panels, or it should go into them anyway. I can't speak for every panel. How's that? All right. It was pretty good. I gotta tell you, I was enjoying listening to myself. I have to confess, sometimes I think I'm really my biggest fan. I'm only kidding. No, maybe not.
Talk to me about the very important work with the Comics Code Authority. Now, you did some drug issue stories, quite controversial in those Spider-Man books, and you helped to relax things with the Comics Code so you can express things more in comics.
I saved the nation. Nobody in the world knows less about drugs than I do. Although I used to get letters all the time, especially for the Dr. Strange stories, asking me what I was on when I wrote those. But one day, I got a letter from Washington, D.C., from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And it said something to the effect of, due to the influence that comic books have with young people, it would really be nice if you would do a story that mentioned the dangers of drug addiction. And I thought that was a worthwhile thing. Now, nobody likes to be lectured to, so I didn't write a story that was a lecture. But we had a 3-part Spider-Man story. It ran for 3 issues. And I figured that would give me room to put in some little anti-drug message. So I don't remember what it was. There's some friend of Peter Parker's had taken something. As I say, I don't really know drugs, but apparently he took some kind of drug that made him think he could fly like a bird. And he was on the roof of a building about to jump off, and Peter Parker, Spider-Man, got there just in time to save him and tell him what an idiot he was for taking those drugs. And that was really essentially what it was. It only took up 2 or 3 pages, but we got our message across. Well, at that time, we had an organization called the Comic Book Association, and they were a censorship body, and all the comic book publishers had to submit their stories to this association before they went to the printer in order to get the seal of approval from the association that we could put on the cover, the seal. When I sent the book to the association, they returned it and they said, you cannot publish this book with the seal of approval because you mentioned drugs, and that's forbidden. So I wrote back and I said, we weren't telling people to take drugs. It was an anti-drug story, and a branch of the government asked us to do it. No, we're sorry, we can't give you the seal of approval. So I was very proud of my publisher. I went to him and I said, you know, I think we ought to publish the book without that damn seal. Who cares? It's a good story, it's worthwhile, and I think we should just publish it. And he agreed. So we sent it out without the seal. And we got more great mail from teachers, from parents, from religious leaders, and that made the Comic Book Code Association open their eyes, and they became a little more real. Oh, I'll tell you a funny story about that. I was once doing a Western book. I think it was called Kid Cold Outlaw. And I had a page that we sent to the association, and they rejected that page. They said I had to do one of the drawings over again. And I said, why? They said, well, I'll tell you what the drawing was. It was just a panel with a picture of a hand. It was our hero's hand, Kid Cole, holding a gun. Now, if you can picture, here's the hand, here's the barrel of the gun, here's the trigger, and from the barrel of the gun, a little puff of smoke was coming out with a straight line indicating the trajectory of the bullet. So here's the gun, his hand holding it on the trigger, the puff of smoke, and a line. That was the panel that they said was too violent. I said, how is that violent? And here's the part you're not going to believe. These geniuses at the code said, the puff of smoke is too big. So they returned the page, and I did my share to protect the youth of America. Instead of the puff of smoke being that big, I made it that big. And they okayed the drawing, and because of that, we're all safe and none of us are homicidal maniacs. I'll never forget that.
Let's talk about the Marvel movies of today. The Marvel movies, you must have been so thrilled when the X-Men came out in 2000, and the last 10 years have been some fantastic movies, which you've appeared in.
Well, of course, the reason I was so thrilled about the first X-Men movie, as you could guess, was because I had a cameo in it. But it wasn't much of a cameo. There was a scene where a character comes out of the water on a beach, and all the people on the beach are looking at him, and one guy in the background is selling hot dogs. And that was me. And you only saw me for a minute. It really didn't give me a chance to live up to my potential. But the idea of that X-Men movie being, it was so good, it was directed by Bryan Singer, who's really as brilliant as a director can be. I don't know if you ever saw it. Before that, he had done a movie, a real movie, not a superhero movie, called The Usual Suspects with Kevin Spacey. It was a fantastic movie. I never thought he could do superhero stuff. In fact, he wasn't a big fan. He spoke to me for a long time before the movie and asked me all sorts of questions about the X-Men, but the movie was a big hit. Now that made me feel good, because I used to be friends with Bob Kane, who created Batman. We were good friends, but Bob always ribbed me, because Batman had come out previously. It was a big hit. And he used to say, yeah, Batman is a big movie hit. Now, your comics, they're okay, Stan, but I don't see them in the theaters. And I had to live with that. Anyway, along came X-Men. And then, what was the next one? Spider-Man?
The next one was Spider-Man in 2002, Daredevil, Hulk, Spider-Man 2, Fantastic Four. Just the list just goes on.
This man is great. Oh, and before that was Blade, the Vampire Hunter. It wasn't as big a movie, but it was the first one of our characters that did well and made us realize, hey, there's a market out there, even if we're not Batman. So then, of course, came the others. I love them. And the beautiful thing about it is these movies